Hello, bonjour. My name is Marianne, co-curator of Abound.
And my name is Rachelle, senior curator at the OAG and co-curator of Abound.
And on the behalf of the Ottawa Art Gallery, we would like to welcome you to our virtual Q&A with Ottawa-based intermedia artist Laura Paolini.
Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge that the Ottawa Art Gallery operates on traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. We're delighted today to be able to share with you a conversation we had with Laura on February 14th, 2022.
In this video, Rachelle, Laura, and I invite you to learn more about Laura's practice, specifically footage, which was shown at the OAG as part of Abound, Art from the University of Ottawa Department of Visual Arts 2021.
Abound is an exhibition of artwork from artists who graduated from the visual arts program at Ottawa University in 2021. We're really lucky this morning to have a chance to talk with Laura Paolini, an artist from Abound MFA exhibition of the 2021 cohort. My name is Rachelle Dickenson, and I am a co-curator and senior curator at the Ottawa Art Gallery. And Marianne.
Hi. Yes, it's such a pleasure to be able to speak to Laura this morning. My name is Marianne Brown. I am co-curator of Abound, and I'm doing this part of an internship with the OAG. It's part of my graduate program at the University of Ottawa. Laura?
Did you want to say a few things about yourself, Laura?
I'll just corroborate what was already been said, I guess. Yeah, my name is Laura Paolini. Pronouns are she, her, and I'm one of the artists in Abound. I completed my MFA in 2021, and I've been living in Ottawa for about 2 years or so, previously from Toronto, but haven't lived there all my life. Yeah, and we're going to talk about this work and other pieces from my practice.
We've had a bit of a week, a bit of a couple of weeks here in Ottawa. And for that reason, we're going to keep it really relaxed and informal and just have a visit and kind of a check-in. However, having said that, your work is really interesting. It's robust, it's complex, deceptively simple, and direct, and it raises a ton of questions. And so I think if Marianne, you want to get started. My dog might start to bark in a second, so I'm going to let you get the conversation going. Thank you.
Perfect. So Laura, I don't know if you wanted to start by introducing the piece briefly for anyone who maybe hasn't had the chance to see it firsthand, or if you just want to dive into questions straight away.
I can offer a brief introduction without any spoilers necessarily. So without too many spoilers, I've made a 24-minute video. It's based in the performance for camera tradition, with a bit of a twist. And it involves myself in an institutional space, working with objects at hand. So I'll stop there for now.
Question for you, Laura, would be, when watching footage, I found that your work was really open to interpretation. You don't explain a whole lot in your artist statements. So when we're reading your artist statements, we get a little bit of a sense of what you're trying to do, but you're not explicit in what you mean. And I think that kind of goes hand in hand with your use of stillness and quietness. By doing so, do you hope to create a particular reaction in your viewers, or are you happy to leave that process in their hands?
In my mind, the best thing I can hope for is that the viewer has a shift in perspective, or perception, I should say, perspective and perception as a result of my work. This doesn't have to be a permanent state change on their part, but for a moment they can think about the world differently. It is a fine line to walk when you keep a critical distance from the pieces you make and their interpretations, but I don't want that to come off as ambivalence. Mm-hmm. So when I'm using my body in my work, it's on a plane with other objects. I'm an element in that piece, not necessarily the focus or the subject per se. The works attempt to point outward from themselves. So this is an intertextual strategy that I use aligned with strategies from performance art, video art, and particularly works of feminist artists from the early 70s, which we'll talk about perhaps a little bit further in the discussion.
an important component of footage, and I think of other works in your of is sound and silence. Can you talk about sound and footage, particularly the eerie sound that comes up over and over again?
I can, though I don't know what the eerie sound is that comes up over and over again, or at least that's not really how I define it. So maybe you can just elaborate what that is, so I can focus on it.
When I wrote that question, I was thinking about the ringing sound, but maybe you don't see it as eerie. I found it eerie. So maybe you can talk about what effect you were hoping to create. And I hope I didn't offend by misinterpreting.
No, it's okay. No, it's just like, I just wanted to clarify, I guess, if there was a particular like sound or moment that was creating that sense in you, or that. I can see there being a few, so that's all right. Most of the sound and footage is from the space where it was shot. There's a hallway and a locked door where there's a repetitive beeping noise coming from, repetitive beeping sound, I should say, perhaps. Other main sounds are the drips from the melting ice, the water fountain in the hallway, being used, and its refrigeration system kicking in. You do hear doors opening and closing, some footsteps, and some conversation. I really like all the sounds, particularly that beeping in the hallway. I like it does kind of have this, it brings another like rhythmic element, and it does make the piece or convey a slightly clinical vibe, if you will, or just it's the kind of sound that you might hear in like a hospital or an institution like that. One thing I discovered while editing and working through the layers of the soundtrack was the frequency of the beeps. By frequency, meaning the pitch and the wavelength that it's delivered at, can't be heard by everyone. I was trying to get some feedback on the piece from a good friend, and he actually couldn't hear the telephone room noise and let me know that. This is as a result of like hearing loss and tinnitus. So in this case, other sounds were more important to him. And the visuals also contained a lot of information that could corroborate what was being seen and heard.
Speaking of a clinical context and all the emotions that can bring up, you have another work that I love, and we've already talked about how much I enjoy it. The heart is an organ that pumps blood, in which you're feeling your pulse, and it's also a pretty quiet performance piece until a Madonna song comes on, which is quite unexpected. And when I was watching it, I felt like I could hear your pulse. I felt like I could feel it throughout my body. And it felt very awkward, kind of like I was intruding in something that I had no business being part of. And in footage too, we can hear your sighs and awkward sounds of you organizing the bags of ice and sitting on them, and just other kind of awkward bodily sounds that naturally come up. How do you think of sound and its impact on the body?
Awkward is kind of like that word eerie, but I think you've defined it pretty well with what you mean, that there's perhaps these elements of the piece that without putting words in your mouth, like maybe they make you feel a little uncomfortable, and maybe that's kind of hard to articulate where that discomfort is. And certainly I would say The Heart, to abbreviate the title, is an intimate piece, and the presence of my body in both works is not something that we're used to witnessing in that way. It's interesting that you say that you can almost feel my pulse as well. But I mean, what's interesting about that piece, and what is a good lesson for me, and what I like about it, is that it did come together relatively quickly, and it is a relatively direct piece. We've addressed this a little bit already, but another big element of my work concerns labor broadly. And sometimes labored actions have sounds to them that aren't typically heard. In general, we don't see a lot of the labor that produces the goods and services we use. And again, going back to the word kind of awkward, like another way to think about that is when labor is revealed, sometimes through sounds or gestures that are more intimate than they are transactional, it can be uncomfortable. And The Heart is a good example in that case, since there's an exchange with someone who's ultimately doing their job. And that brought attention to my own being and caused a type of emotional state change, releasing this thing we don't notice. Similarly with footage, there is some embodied gestures and muscle memory there. So I liken some of the gestures or experiences that if anyone has worked for a small venue, or maybe they've worked for an artist center or a nonprofit, where they've had to go get like bags of ice for an opening or an event. Some of the preparations and collection may seem more familiar. And in footage, there is that part where there's a little more transparency to the piece, where despite the camera being my de facto audience, there are moments where the sterility and virtuosity that a lot of performance art is associated with does start to unwind a little bit. I do sigh. I move around. I move physically on the bags of ice, look around the room, and at one point, yes, I do prop myself up a little bit to balance and kick the ice, causing more water to fall out from collecting underneath me. Those are kind of the moments in footage that I think bring it out of its kind of container as an artwork as well. If that makes sense. Yeah, like it's still very much like, you can't necessarily read it as not art, if that makes sense, but everything, it does point out to a different environment, if that makes sense.
It does make sense on sort of one hand in terms of thinking about bringing it out of its container, which I like. I like the idea of that, and maybe we can, if we have time, we'll circle back to that idea. But one of the things that your work provides is, and I've written this down because I'm trying to figure out the language for it and I can't. It's like I like the word intimacy when we're talking about relations between people, objects, all of those things, spaces. This idea of intimacy, for me, it can be a reassuring term. And so with your work, I want to combine it with reluctant or strained. So you create an environment in footage where we're with you, but it's not comfortable necessarily. It's kind of like a strained, maybe reluctant, it depends. But for me, it was kind of a strained intimacy. So we had that, in my mind, there's that paradox between sharing a space with you and the close-up shots of footage, like the stereo, which is hugely nostalgic for me because I used to have one like that. And then the plastic chairs and the IKEA bags, like there's all these triggers. And I'm there with you and I feel like I'm with you, but I'm also not with you, right? It's just, I'm not with you. I'm just in the space. So that contributes to a sense of discomfort, which is productive, very productive, especially when we're thinking about the way that intimacy works. So I wanted to ask you, in that context, if you want to either go with my articulation or come up or like present your own, it's up to you. What role does discomfort play in your practice? As a huge setup for a very simple question. Sorry.
No, that was great. Yes, constrained aesthetics. That is something I've been accused of, which is great. I think is fine. And discomfort, there are two ways to answer your question. I'm trying to think of the ways to encapsulate the different ways to answer it. Because I don't want to leave the audience out of the picture. Though I think there is this kind of recognition where, with the question of like what's uncomfortable, what's uncomfortable in my work isn't necessarily like physical, if that makes sense. It isn't necessarily the fact that I'm sitting for hours or trying to get out of a mattress or balance on a chair, in a chair, on a chair. This is going way back to 2019 pieces. But it also comes back to sort of talking about larger structural things in relation to the more direct, intimate, interpersonal. One example of that is a piece called It's Like Talking to a Wall, which you can call it a performance, you can call it a video installation with a live element. There's different ways to kind of frame that, where there's a narrative being delivered that weaves in and out of very factual information about how bananas get to North America, and a relationship that I have with someone who doesn't live near me anymore, basically, who ultimately isn't really part of my life anymore. So the viewer is kind of balancing how these two narratives run parallel to each other and interweave with each other. And part of what made, I think, that piece a little bit uncomfortable is it's kind of a very fluid definition of performance and video. And it's about a year old now. I did it in like February 2020. And there are moments where I also bring back into like physical intimacy and proximity, and how like charged and difficult that is right now for many reasons. Yeah, there's the piece ends with me, again, without revealing any spoilers, though I never know I don't know if I'll do this piece ever again, so we'll see. Yeah, the viewers are watching me through live video from another room, and the piece concludes where I fog up a window with my breath, basically, and the condensation creates, where I liken it to creating a type of ocean that I've talked about in the piece, and I use it to sort of place a boat postcard on the windowsill. So in that piece, there's a few things happening that you kind of talk about, where like the audience is definitely there and very distant, both physically and in various distance to like what the piece is about, or what the subject matter is, I should say, not what the piece is about, the subject matter. And that level of detachment can also like be really productive and really fruitful, because it also like just kind of opens things up a lot. And I'm really just kind of there as a gentle guiding hand in some ways. As awkward as some of the gestures or pieces might be, like it's all just sort of meant to point back outside the piece.
Thank you for that. That was really lush. Of course, I have more questions, but Marianne, no, go ahead.
Well, I'll skip one question because I think you just brought up some really interesting points about kind of the relationships between people that can emerge and be negotiated through your performances. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your more recent work at Text Me When You Get Home, which I know you have complex thoughts about, maybe a little bit of tension. But I was wondering, how did the space and the collaborative nature of the performance differ from what you've done before?
I might need to talk about what you mean by the space a little bit. And collaborative nature. Because I don't necessarily, the piece was still like delivered to an audience. So similarly, which we addressed with Rachelle already, it's like I wouldn't necessarily call it collaborative as much as I would call it participatory. People could choose to participate. We can talk about that a little bit more later. The call for that particular performance event, this was part of the PERF Performance Biennale hosted by Axneo Set in Gatineau. My event was called Through the Looking Glass, and it was curated by Thomas Grogan and Anna Kiesma. And the call initially was about a rethinking of the relationship between the live event and its dissemination, and how bodies are read through and in response to screens. So perfect. And I did enjoy working on the piece and doing it outside. I don't know if that's what you mean by like space. And the research that went into the work and where it took place, it was kind of coming back to like the awareness of the gaze of others and the presence of a body. So again, like my body is the body in case in point here largely. So one way I was kind of thinking about it too was there have been lots of conceptual and performance art pieces where walking is one of the primary conceits. This particular piece I think is more of an antithesis to a lot of what was going on there, but Vito Acconti's Following piece from 1969, for example, the artist kind of documented himself following people in New York City. And his rules were like when they went into a building, like he would stop. And this was done in collaboration with an architectural festival, if I recall. And other ways we see walking, especially as a group, which is ultimately what kind of happened in that piece, was also in gestures of solidarity, such as protests, like feminist organizing, for example, like the Take Back the Night walks that happen globally. So what I was kind of working on in this piece was taking some of the things that I did in It's Like Talking to a Wall, but making it mobile. So people could join me physically walking. There was an audio component that people could listen to through their phones. There were some moments where people could participate and share things on their phone because we were trying to use Zoom as a platform as well. That mechanically was pretty clunky and complicated. Again, mobile wise, but there's still a lot of things I really like about that piece. And one of the main elements of it was part of the narrative was about going to see a movie in Helsinki on the longest day of the year. And in that place of the world, that's where there's like easily 20 hours of daylight. And the movie was It Follows. I don't know if anyone's seen that. It's from 2015. It's really good. It's a really interesting horror movie. So I was talking about that and other experiences I had kind of living abroad while walking with a group simultaneously, like with me and following, and how those elements are kind of there. So yeah, participatory perhaps, kind of the same way seeing a movie is participatory in a way, that you can leave when you want to, and things like that. Yeah, so I don't know if that tells you more than what my website does or anything like that. I'm still parsing out that piece and a lot of things with it, because there are some things that I really, really like.
It does help. It sounds like it must have been a really rich experience for the people who were able to participate.
And I hope those that couldn't can forgive me someday.
What do you see yourself doing next?
I'm interested in doing more live work, where and when that's possible. I'm thinking a lot about mantras, and how those can be very singular, but how those can possibly be like shared, or other rituals that can be brought together through them. I'll still be working with video in many ways as well. But that's sort of what's on my mind right now.
How has a couple more questions that are not hard, but they're also not sort of what you've prepared for.
All good.
All good. It's good to be prepared, but how has working in the pandemic impacted your practice? Are you thinking about art? Or are you thinking about exhibition? You're in a show right now that's been certainly impacted by the pandemic as well as the convoy. Is it having a strong influence on the way that you're thinking about your artwork and your views on art?
I mean, it can't not in many ways. That being said, how I work and kind of what I was interested in doing even though I think it's become a lot more clear, and that's as a result of grad school and dedicated study more than anything. But I just happened to be going through grad school during the pandemic, which still, you know, it's there for sure. And that's kind of an observation I make, is that, like, you know, still a lot of the work I do and was doing before that was like usually me and the camera, or, you know, someone else with me. But they're very like tight shots, not a lot of the well, you know, while what's outside the frame is addressed, it's not necessarily like focused on or exposed, but it's there, and it definitely can be trying in a lot of ways. Yeah, I oscillate between these, my feelings about my practice, particularly with the context of the pandemic, and with my practice in general as well. Like, I do like these moments where I think there can be a lot of freedom when you're kind of on the periphery of, when you're kind of on the periphery, and just able to try and like quietly do your own thing. There are still moments where you're also like, I really want someone to validate this, or chat with me more, or like, you know, things like that, or like sort of recognize that there is, where there could be some more recognition. But that being said, you know, it's just hard right now for everyone. And I think what I hope ultimately that comes out of it is kind of really important questions about, or really important, I shouldn't say questions, but recognition and like solutions towards like sustainable and viable ways to live. Very big, broad things like that. And particularly with the exhibition, I think that's an interesting irony to it, because certainly that was happening too, like in school, where like how institutions change slowly. It can happen, but it does happen like kind of slowly. So sort of negotiating the criteria for evaluating fine arts, like during a pandemic, renegotiating or redefining what constitutes a critique and things like that, were and I think still are going to be challenges. I kind of made a joke to one of my thesis advisors when I was running around in April to set up both to like set up a critique or work for a critique, and like move studios and stuff like that, where I made a kind of a quip about just like setting up artwork that no one's going to see. And the thing is, they said, like, you know what though, like, that's what a lot of artwork and artists, and that's what a lot of artists do, and that's what a lot of artwork is, if we're being honest about it, and people could be more honest about it. That wasn't meant to be deflating or anything like that, because I realize you guys have all worked really hard in putting up this show, and there's been like bizarre interruption after interruption.
It wasn't deflating. I didn't find it deflating at all. I found it somewhat liberating, because we can be honest about it, and the frustration that goes along with how quickly things are changing around the physical space, particularly in Ottawa. But then I also find it reassuring that we're kind of all in this together. Although my last question, maybe, unless Marianne wants to jump in with one more, is, and this is also off book, but I'm curious about, we have questions for you, but do you have questions for us? Like, Marianne and I have made a series of decisions about your work and its installation, and the installation of your colleagues' works. And we've really done that largely without a huge amount of participation from any of you. We talked, which is great. But from the relationship to talking across disciplines, talking across practices, also industries, do you have any questions for us about why we did what we did? And if you don't, or if you do, and you think they might be a little bit edgy, we can cut it. But I want to answer a question that you might have for us, if you want, including critiques.
Not really, to be honest. If anything, I was finding it a little almost too participatory at one point, which I guess just hasn't, you know, with my exhibition experience, limited that it is, like, you don't necessarily get to negotiate a lot. And I think you guys have been pretty open to like having me come in and see things and hear things and stuff like that, which is, you know, which I can do since I am in Ottawa right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I guess because I was pretty clear on what I was showing, how I would like it to be showed. And I think some people were still like, you know, weren't sure which piece they were going to show, or which, you know, some people were still producing a couple of paintings and stuff like that. And I wasn't really going to do anything like that. So maybe it was a bit more straightforward of a discussion with us.
It was delightfully straightforward. I'm grateful for that. Marianne, did you have any other questions? I'm going to mute because there's a truck backing down my street.
I didn't have any questions. No, this has been so lovely. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Laura, for joining us today. I really appreciate it. I'm trying to take advantage of reduced noise on my street as part of being in the convoy. Shit, I didn't have it. So thanks very much for your time today. And hopefully we'll continue to have conversations as your practice develops. And yeah. Thank you. It's been a privilege and a pleasure to talk to you about your practice.
That was really kind. Thank you. I enjoyed myself as well.
Thank you for joining us. We would encourage viewers to check out Laura's Instagram page at laura.paolini and her website, www.laurapaolini.com.